Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus Podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he is the President of Risen Jesus, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jarris, your host. On today's episode, we discuss the empty tomb and what it means for the historical bedrock, for the facts pertaining to the historical Jesus, his life, death, and the aftermath. And so we'll be discussing that aftermath when we discuss here with our resident expert, Dr. Mike Licona. Mike, great to see you today.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it. This has been a fun season.
Yes, it has. We've been covering a lot of subjects, really a lot of meat here, looking at the bedrock, or what you call the historical bedrock, or the facts pertaining here to the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and all the players, the events and players that form that discussion. And so on today's episode, we're going to look at the empty tomb and what that means. I've got some questions myself for you, and then towards the end, we'll take some questions from some listeners. So tell me about, why is the empty tomb important when looking at the case for the resurrection of Jesus?
Well, if Jesus was raised physically, bodily, materially from the dead, as I believe that Paul seems to think, and the Jerusalem apostles, well then, if there's a narrative, the story that narrates his resurrection, we would expect an empty grave of some sort. And we have that with all four Gospels. All four Gospels report that Jesus was raised physically, bodily, materially from the dead, and exited the tomb, leaving it empty.
Okay,
and this is, let me just add, this is entirely consistent with what Paul taught.
All right, so all four Gospels, there's an empty tomb. Seems like an open and shut case. Are there any New Testament scholars that object to the notion of an empty tomb?
Oh, sure. There's quite a few of them. Now, Gary Habermas has actually been a bean counter with this, and he's been keeping track of where scholars are on over 100 topics related to the resurrection of Jesus since 1975, the empty tomb being one of them. He says that, I don't know what the actual number is right now, but the last he said it was right around 75%. I think just below 75%. But that was his figure, I think, 15, 17 years, 18 years ago. Well, no, it was probably 2005, 2006. So it's still, maybe 15 years ago. It might have changed since then. I know before that time, when we wrote our book in 2004, it came out. So we wrote it in 2003, it was finished. He was around 75%. Then it dipped down to about 2/3, and he continued to add more sources to it as he's putting together his bibliography. I think he started off, when we wrote our book, was 2,200, 2,400 sources, massive, And now I think it's over 5,300, maybe closer to 5,400 sources. So more than twice what he had when it was 75%. Then it dipped down to 2/3. Now it's like 15 years ago, it was just shy of 75%. I don't know what it is now.
So this is one of the more, if not the most hotly disputed of the 12 facts that Habermas proposes here. And so what's sort of an alternative view to the empty tomb? Would it be something like the wrong tomb, a mass grave approach?
Yeah, the main one, I mean, long ago, it was, the disciples stole the body, right? We find that in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew, whenever you think it was written, whether early or late, Matthew is telling his readers, who would have known whether he's telling the truth, he's telling them that the Jewish leadership continues to spread this rumor to this very day. So we know that sometime in the first century, that the Jewish leadership was saying the disciples stole the body, which I think is interesting, because why would you say the disciples stole the body if it was still there, right? You wouldn't. Now, of course, they could have spread this later on after the Gospels were written, and if we know up till the time of the year 70, you had those burial boxes called ossuaries that many Jews were using, that they'd put the bones in after the corpse decomposed for a year. Then they reburied the bones. So, maybe the fact that they're saying the disciples stole the body, they couldn't prove it otherwise, one way or the other, if they had buried Jesus' bones in an ossuary somewhere. You've got Tertullian, who mentions toward the end of the 2nd century that the gardener had a lettuce patch by the tomb, and it was going. The rumor was that the gardener reburied the body because he was afraid that visitors coming out to pay homage to Jesus at his tomb would trample over his lettuce. But that, being spread around, still gives an alternate explanation to why the tomb was empty. It's not disputing the empty tomb. You have Celsus in the middle of the 2nd century, who is saying that Jesus used magic to fake his death on the cross. He went unconscious, and then he was revived in the tomb and came out. And but again, that is not to dispute an empty tomb. It's just to give an alternate explanation for it. Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century said that the Jewish leadership was still claiming in that day, he says this in his dialogue with Trypho, that they were still saying, spreading the rumor that the disciples had stolen the body. Still, the only kind of explanations, alternative explanations to the empty tomb, is to explain how the tomb came to become empty. They're not disputing whether the tomb was empty. And I think it's pretty telling.
Yeah, so there's that implication that it still is in fact empty. Okay, yeah. So is there, for you, when you're looking at your method here, do you find that the empty tomb qualifies as part of the historical bedrock?
I don't. I do think there's good reasons for it, and I typically provide a few, like, the Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus is first proclaimed in Jerusalem, which would be difficult to do if the body was still in the tomb. And, you could expose any kind of body, if it had any kind of stature that even resembled Jesus, you couldn't have, dispelled the rumor of the resurrection. So the fact that it started in Jerusalem, I think that gives evidence for it. I mentioned how it is enemy attested, and they're only providing alternative explanations to the empty tomb. I think the strongest evidence may be the testimony of women. In the 1st century, a woman's testimony was certainly not regarded anywhere near as credible as the testimony of a male. So if you're going to invent a story about a resurrection and include an empty tomb, a story that's already going to be very, very difficult for most people to swallow, why are you going to make it doubly difficult by making your primary witnesses women, whom are going to be of questionable? It'd be like today, if you're going to make a story, you're going to invent a story that is very difficult to believe, for others to believe, and you want people to believe it. And they say, well, how do you know this? And you say, well, my witness is so-and-so. Well, who's so-and-so? Well, he's a thug. He was in prison recently for forgery and for deceiving, and he's my primary witness. Well, that's what you're looking at here. I mean, Josephus says that a woman's testimony was less valuable, or is about the same level as a thief or a robber. That's how good, how much it was valued back then by Jews. So again, if you're going to fabricate account about a resurrection and empty tomb, you're just not going to make the women your primary witnesses. So you got some good evidence, I think, for the empty tomb. The reason I don't include it is, by the way, you do have a heterogeneous majority who grant it. So you even have some non-believers who grant it. Like Pincus Lapide, he was a Jewish scholar and a New Testament scholar. He actually believed Jesus rose from the dead. He just says he doesn't think that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Savior for the Gentiles. But he believed the tomb was empty. He believed Jesus rose from the dead. You do have a couple other non-believers, scholars, who think the tomb was empty. So you could say it's a heterogeneous majority, but by far the majority of scholars who grant the empty tomb are Christian scholars. And it doesn't come up to the level, even though it's a majority, if it's around 75%, that's a pretty strong majority. But I like it to be 90% or more for what I'm doing here. For my criteria for accepting something as historical bedrock. So it didn't quite make a strong enough majority, and it's certainly not a robust heterogeneity of scholarship that is granting it. So although I believe the tomb was empty, and I think the evidence is sufficient for that, it doesn't raise to the level of being a minimal fact, of being historical bedrock.
Let me ask you a question about the empty tomb. It's related here. From Matthew, we have this passage about guards being placed at the tomb. Well, okay, so let's suppose that the disciples stole the body, and then afterward, the Jewish leaders are saying, "Hey, they stole the body." If you were Matthew or the Christian community, maybe you would invent a story to try to dispel the accusations, even though they were true. This is all hypothetical. That the Jewish leaders placed guards at the tomb. Wouldn't that sort of be a sneaky way of getting away with having stole the body if the story were invented?
Yeah, it would be. I mean, we can't rule that out, of course. Anything that comes with history, we can't get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusions. So what you've proposed is certainly possible, but of course historians are looking for the most probable explanation. I will say that the majority of critical New Testament scholars do not accept the historicity of the report about the guard at the tomb. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means that's where the majority is today when it comes to this. I would look and I'd say, well, does Matthew, does he give us good reason to think that he fabricates things elsewhere? And what I would do then is I would say, well, how do we test that? Well, I would test Matthew on how he uses Mark. We know that we're pretty confident that Matthew used Mark quite extensively. Same thing with Luke. Luke and Matthew used Mark extensively. So they certainly edit Mark. Sometimes they unpack him and provide additional details. Matthew tends to abbreviate the stuff in Mark. But, we can see how Matthew used Mark, and he treats Mark with a lot of integrity. He doesn't change anything about the essence of the story. The core is still there. And then there is the hypothetical Q source. Now, some think that Luke used Matthew. That's entirely possible. Entirely possible. I tend to think that Matthew and Luke used a common source that we refer to as Q. Q being short for Quelle, the German word for source. So I view Q as a written document containing the teachings of Jesus, and that it was without narrative. So I think it was probably notes taken by one of Jesus' disciples they took along, and then later on it was expanded. Now, I could be wrong on that, but that's, all of it is speculation with that, and some of it is more informed than others, but that's how I view Q. So we look at how Matthew used Q, we look at how Luke used Q, and yep, they edit Q, but they stay pretty close to it. If where I can test Matthew, I don't see him fabricating, then that gives me some pretty good confidence that he's not fabricating where I can't test him. Now, does that mean he doesn't fabricate or invent a story? No. But I can only go with what I see or what I perceive that I'm seeing. And I just don't think he's doing it elsewhere. I can't prove that he's not doing it. There are occasions where scholars are going to think he is, like with the Passion narratives, But, anyway, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, well, and certainly the stolen body hypothesis is rife with other errors. But furthermore, we could think that Matthew is generally reliable, generally historically reliable. And so until we have reason otherwise to think that the disciples or the Christian community invented this story, we might think, yeah, this is a historical. But for our project here, yeah, we're not talking about historical bedrock material about the guards being placed at the tomb. So, yeah, good. All right, well, I've got another question for you, Mike, here. And I've got here this chart that hangs up in our office here at Defenders Media, a chart of 5 different views on the timeline of the crucifixion. And I think I've got it all in frame here. It's all a big picture here. 5 different views, 3 of them holding to a Friday crucifixion, one of them the Thursday crucifixion, and one a Wednesday crucifixion timeline. And you've got your own view on the date, the day of the week in which Jesus died, and that relates to the 3-day motif that we have in the Gospels. So tell me, what's your view on the day of the crucifixion of Jesus, and your thoughts on the 3-day motif?
Well, almost all scholars are going to place, or they're going to locate Jesus' death by crucifixion on Friday, the Passover. And so the question then would remain is, how do you reconcile it with some other things, especially, say, the sign of Jonah, where in Matthew specific there, Jesus says, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so would the Son of Man be in the earth and then rise. So if you back out from Sunday morning, 3 days and 3 nights, it doesn't take you to Friday, where Jesus dies and is buried Friday afternoon. So how do you reconcile those things? And then, the Passover meal, you do have the attention in John, where John, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a number of other scholars, it seems like that last meal with Jesus is not framed as a Passover meal. In fact, to the contrary, it is not, it seems, at least my reading of the text, starting at John 13, verses 1 and 2, and then what follows. It doesn't seem like it's a Passover meal. And then I think it's 1829, they deliver Jesus over to Pilate, but they don't follow him into the praetorium so that they wouldn't be defiled and could eat the Passover that evening. So I think there's a couple of indicators in John's gospel that would suggest that Jesus was crucified before the Passover meal was to be eaten. So that could still place it on Friday, right? But we find the Passover meal in the synoptics being eaten Thursday evening. So what do we do here? How do we do this? Well, I discussed this at length in my book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I do think for theological reasons, John has relocated it just a day earlier in order to accommodate or to make some theological points that Jesus is the burnt offering for our sins and the Passover, our Passover lamb. I think John also alters the time a little bit, and this is not unusual for John. It's not unusual for ancient authors to do it either, other biographers and historians. In terms of the 3 days and 3 nights, I think that this is a temporal figure of speech. The Akkadian language had a 3-day motif of saying 3 days and 3 nights for a figure of speech to say, you're healing. If you do this, take this medicine, you'll feel better soon. They just say 3 days and 3 nights, you'll feel better soon. We have stuff like this. Like when my kids were young, I'd say, hey, go out and pull up some weeds in the garden. And that'd take me forever. Well, no, it won't take you forever. It may take you an hour, Or you go and, hey, I'll be with you in just a minute. Well, we know that the person is not saying 60 seconds. It's a short period of time. Or just give me a second on that. Well, you've taken 5. Now, come on, Mac. That's not what's going on. These are temporal figures of speech. What leads me to believe this, there's a few things here, Kurt. So number one, you have Jesus' resurrection mentioned in a few ways. After 3 days and 3 nights, after 3 days, and on the 3rd day. In fact, Matthew includes all 3. Luke has on the 3rd day and after 3 days. Well, on the 3rd day is different than after 3 days. So I think we have a 3-day motif here, meaning just a short period of time, and it's just stated in different ways. We find the same kind of thing in the book of Esther, where I think it's her uncle, Mordecai, comes to her and says, hey, you know, Haman's doing this thing and we're all going to die as Jews. And she says, tell you what, go back and tell the people, the Jews, to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And after that, I will go in to see the king. And it says, and so Mordecai did, and the people fasted for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the 3rd day, Esther went in to see the king. Again, this just seems like a temporal figure of speech here. And then finally, you've got in Matthew's gospel, the Jewish leaders come to Pilate on Saturday and say, we remembered when that deceiver said that he would be raised from the dead after 3 days. So grant us a guard so that we may guard the tomb until the 3rd day, so that his disciples don't come and steal the body, and then the new deceit is worse than the first. Well, if you're going to take this 3-day motif in a very literal sense, Jesus is going to be raised from the dead sometime after 3 days, right? But they're only asking for a guard until the 3rd day. They're going to remove that guard at the very time they need the guard most. So I think there's good reason here to think that when any of these 3 days and 3 nights, after 3 days, on the 3rd day, these are just different ways of saying in a short period of time. And so we don't have to say, well, even an hour or 2 hours of a day counts as a whole day. I mean, you could do that. I don't think that'd be stretching it too far. And it might be correct. I just think if we're trying to really take this in an uber literal sense, it's just going to lead us down the wrong path. I think it's just best to look at this as a temporal figure of speech, meaning a short period of time, and then it just happened within 36 hours later, however you want to look at it.
Yeah. All right, we've run out of time, so let's quickly take 2 questions here. I think the first question here will be short, and it comes from Dean. What are your thoughts on Dr. Andrew Loke's work regarding the resurrection? What, if any, original contribution had he made to the topic?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't read Professor Loke's book. I've heard very good things about it from those in the apologetics community who are reading it. People have said some really good stuff about it, but I haven't read it myself. So, and it's not because I don't want to. It's just right now, and for the last 8 years or so, my focus has moved away from resurrection and gone to gospel differences and the historical reliability of the gospel. So I'm only reading things at this point that relate directly to my present research.
Sure. Okay, and then this question, last question, comes from Twitter. What do you think about historical critical method? Looks like it's used only in research of the Bible's historicity, not any secular history. Why is that allowed?
Well, I don't know that is true, that it's only used in biblical stuff. Maybe that's what biblical scholars refer to it as the historical critical method, and maybe it's not used by classicists or general historians in that sense. But the historical critical method simply is you are looking at history through critical eyes. You're looking at historical reports through critical eyes. Doesn't necessarily mean skeptical. It's just saying, well, what's the evidence for this? Historical critical method looks at reports to say, did this person say something like this? Did this event actually occur? That's what the historical method is. It's for historians. Now, in the evangelical community, usually those on the far right, they make use of what's called the historical grammatical method. And nothing wrong with the historical grammatical method. It's just a different method for a different purpose. The historical grammatical method looks at a text and using the grammar, the language that it's used, and what we know about the historical background of the text in which the text is written, understanding the culture and everything, it's all used in order to interpret that text. So the historical grammatical method is used for interpreting a text, whereas the historical critical method is used by a historian to say, well, did this actually occur? Did this person actually say this or something like it? So they serve different purposes. The reason a theologian, the historical grammatical method is going to be used by a theologian, not a historian. And the reason they're not even interested in the historical critical method, and I'm referring to theologians on the far right who insist on the historical grammatical method over the historical critical method, is because they are just a priori accepting everything in Scripture as true for theological reasons. And I'm not going to say that that is wrong, but that's doing the work of a theologian, not a historian. My work as a historian cannot make such assumptions. And so if I'm going to do exegesis to see what I come to the text, I'm going to look at it in the New Testament in Greek. I'm going to study the cultural background and everything. That's doing historical grammatical method. But if I'm approaching the text like we're doing with the resurrection to see, did he really rise from the dead? What led to the disciples and Paul's belief that the risen Jesus had actually appeared to them? Well, I've got to use the historical critical method. I don't have the luxury of making theological assumptions.
Good. Thanks for that answer to that question from one of your listeners. And, this has been a real fun season. We've covered a lot of ground here, looking at the historical bedrock. We first started asking that question, what is historical bedrock? Then we went and began looking at the life of Jesus, how he was seen as a miracle worker, an exorcist, an eschatological agent. We looked at predictions he made about his death and his vindication or resurrection. And then we looked at the evidence for his death. We looked at evidence for the appearances. We spent 3 episodes on Paul and Paul's conversion experience. Then we talked about James, and now the empty tomb. We've covered a lot of ground here looking at this case, and in next season, we're going to be considering the different hypotheses that evaluate this historical data. And so that should be really fun, considering the hypotheses. And I'd like to think that the historical resurrection will be the one that proves triumphant over all the other hypotheses, Mike. All right, well, if this podcast has been a blessing to you, would you consider supporting our work? You can go to risenjesus.com/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the work and ministry of Dr. Licona, you can go to risenjesus.com, and it's there that you can find authentic answers to genuine questions about the resurrection of Jesus and the historical reliability of the Gospels. This has been the Risen Jesus Podcast, a ministry of Dr. Mike Licona.